Welcome, everyone, to the PWGC Environmental Echo. Today, we're going to be talking about brownfields. I know that's a hot topic in New York City and on Long Island, and we've got two guests with us today. We've got Andy Lockwood, a Senior Vice President from PWGC. We also have Jennifer Lewis, a Senior Project Manager from PWGC. And I'm your host, Paul Boyce, President and CEO of PWGC. So, if there are any questions, comments, or concerns regarding this podcast, or if you want more information, you can always reach us on our website, which is pwgrocer.com/podcast, and we look forward to hearing from our listeners. So let's just dive right into this, as we always do with our topics. And Jennifer, Andy, why don't you guys try to explain or tell me what a brownfield exactly is? I'm sure people are dying to know.
A brownfield is a site that has actual or perceived environmental issues. And those issues could be historical issues in New York City, on Long Island, former industrial sites, gas station sites, dry cleaning sites, sites that had historic fill deposited in them to build up a wetlands to make the site suitable for development. And those sites are now being rezoned, maybe for a higher use, going from industrial to a mixed-use development, a commercial development, or a strictly residential development. And developers are somewhat reluctant sometimes to take on that site because of those issues. And so in New York State, the DEC has, in order to incentivize the development of those properties, developed a program, a New York State Brownfield Cleanup Program.
The BCP.
BCP.
Can you guys describe what that is? Who's eligible? How do you get into the program? What's available to people that are looking to clean up a site and redevelop it?
The Brownfield Cleanup Program is administered by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, and they work in conjunction with the New York State Department of Health, because overall the most important thing that we care about is the health of people that are going to be living on these properties. So the fundamentals of the program include the investigation of the property in terms of what contamination may exist at the site.
Jennifer, who is eligible for this BCP, this Brownfields Cleanup Program?
It's actually easier to discuss who is not eligible for the program. In New York State, you cannot be a Class 1 or a Class 2 inactive hazardous waste site. You cannot have an active order on consent on the site. Generally, other than that, you are eligible for the Brownfield Cleanup Program as long as you have a certain level of contamination at the site.
So what qualifies as that minimum level of contamination?
That will actually depend on what is the intended use of the property or the perceived intended use of the property.
All right. For instance, we deal with a lot of developers that like to go in maybe some mixed use. They may have some, commercial businesses on a first floor or two, and then if it's a high-rise, they may have a few stories of residential. What would that be? So
in that case, they'd have to meet the strictest use of the property, which would be the residential. So they'd want to meet the restricted residential soil cleanup objectives. And that actually brings back another point, is that you have to show contamination on your site that originated from your site. It cannot be contamination migrating from a neighboring site.
Briefly, how do you guys go about demonstrating that? What's the key to saying, okay, this happened here, as opposed to it came from one of my neighbors or somebody further away?
So we start off with a phase 1 site investigation that lets us go into the history of the property, and we can identify potential sources of contamination and where those sources may exist in the property. Then we do the phase 2 investigation, which is a more intrusive study. It involves collecting soil, groundwater, or soil vapor samples, and we analyze those samples for a specific list of compounds, and then we compare them to the state standards to identify if there is actually contamination that exists on the site and that originates from the site. Usually we can tell if it originates from the site if we find it in the soil samples above the water table. The reason why we look for it above the water table is that contamination may migrate on the water table from a nearby site. So if you just find it in the groundwater or you just find it in the soil vapor, you're not 100% sure it's your issue.
Interesting. So in my mind, and I'm sure in others, undertaking an endeavor like this to clean up a property that you didn't make the mess, right? It's going to cost some money. So what incentives are there available to people who go into this program, to get them in, to attract them, to want to do something like this, to do something that's beneficial, to redevelop, Obviously the benefits from an economic standpoint or a housing standpoint, but what about to the guy that's, guy or gal that's going to undertake this project? What kind of incentives are out there?
Let's talk about first the two different types of participants. There's a volunteer, and then there's a participant, correct? The participant, they own the program when the environmental and cause the environmental
So they own
condition.
the property.
Right.
The original property owner.
But
Okay.
in New York State, since they did away with the voluntary cleanup program, a PRP, a primary responsible party, only has the BCP program or a Class 1 or Class 2 inactive hazardous waste site program to get into, and to go through a regulated program to get to the end point where you get some type of notice of completion or notice of satisfaction that your environmental issue has been taken care of. So then the volunteer. So the volunteer is someone that maybe just purchased the property recently, went through their due diligence, did a phase 1, phase 2, in order to complete the property transaction, which is pretty standard in New York State nowadays. And knows that there's some environmental concern, but they didn't cause it. Now they're eligible for the BCP program as a volunteer. And as a volunteer, you can get both the tax credits and the liability protection that the program offers.
So tax credits, to me, that's incentive, right?
That is the largest incentive that most people think of when they think of the Brownfield cleanup
All
program.
right.
Yeah, they're not asking us about the liability protection. It's how much money can I get, Jennifer?
Yes.
Right. So it's my understanding that there's different types of tax credits, right? And two of them that come to mind are the site prep credit and the tangible property credit. Jennifer, can you explain the difference between those two types of tax credits for a volunteer?
Sure. So the site prep credit should be considered, it's also called the remediation credit. It is all of the costs that go into actually remediating the property. And that is more than just the cost of disposing of soil or doing some type of treatment. That also includes your legal fees, your environmental consultant fees, your engineering fees, your supportive excavation fees. You have to be able to do this work safely. You can't undermine your neighboring building just to remediate your site. There's several other things that can, fencing can go into the remediation credit, whatever it takes to actually remediate your site in a safe manner.
All your contaminated soil transport and disposal.
Yes. The actual investigation of the site. Once you enter the program, that's when the clock starts, or that's when the ticker starts going on what you can receive credit on.
Is there a limit or a maximum, or is there a cap on how much is creditable, if that's the right term?
On the site remediation portion, there is not a cap. On the tangible property credit, which we also call the development credit, there is a cap. So this portion of the tax credit is best used for a person that is going to redevelop a site. You don't need to redevelop a site to enter the BCP program, but it is the most lucrative way to get additional tax credits back. The tax credit cap for the tangible property credits is the lesser of one of these three options. $35 million for a property, which can go up to $45 million if it is an industrial property. That's option one. Option two is 3 times the cost of your site remediation. So if your site remediation costs $3 million, you can get $9 million on the property development credit. The third option is a percentage that is based upon certain criteria. You start off with a 10% baseline, and if you meet certain requirements that
10% of what?
10% of your tangible property costs.
Okay.
So if your building is going to cost $100 million to construct, you can get $10 million on that
Got it.
version.
Thank you.
So it starts off with a 10% baseline, and it can go up in 5% increments based upon certain things. If you meet a track 1 cleanup, which is the strictest cleanup level, then that's another 5% bonus. If you have, if you're in a Brownfield opportunity area, that's another 5% bonus, and that will cap out at 24%. So of those 3 options, whichever is the lesser is what will constitute your tangible property credit.
And I would just like to chime in there that Jen obviously knows what she's talking about. She put together a Excel spreadsheet that she uses to on a site-by-site basis and based on the very nitty-gritty specifics of the potential redevelopment for a client, what their potential remediation tax credit and tangible tax credit might be. It's really helpful to our clients to really understand that information before they get too far into the project.
Absolutely.
As a company, we can offer our clients the best service the sooner we get involved in the project. So a lot of times we have clients that are engaging P.W. Grosser before they own the property. They understand the BCP program to an extent, and want us to do that due diligence part of the property transaction, the phase 1, phase 2. They want us involved in the purchase sale agreement because they can use that information to affect the sale price of the property. We usually generate some type of cost estimate at that point for our clients. And then Jen can do her calculations on her tax credit, potential tax credits through the program, and they can see, okay, these are the environmental concerns. This is the probable cost to cure. These are the potential tax credits if I could go into the program. If they wait too long and they're contacting us, after they've already purchased the property, and sometimes it just doesn't work out because the problem is a lot bigger than the potential benefits of the program.
I mean, this is a real incentive. I mean, the tangible property credit or development credit, as you called it. You had these 3 different options, and it's the least of the 3. It sounded like, the one you mentioned was $35 to $45 million. If that ended up being the least of your 3, I mean, it's a tremendous benefit to someone looking to possibly redevelop a site that's got these issues.
Sure. We actually have a couple of sites that are looking at that being the lesser of the 3, and those are going to be some amazing developments.
That will certainly help. I mean, are there any other factors that go into calculating these credits? Like, what are some of the other aspects? Andy mentioned this Excel spreadsheet that you've developed, at P.W. Grosser to help people with this. Are there anything we didn't cover that might be of interest?
Sure. I find a lot of the clients, they like to have that spreadsheet. They like to see, what that value could be, and they compare that to what the BCP is going to do to their construction schedule. Going through the Brownfield cleanup program can be time intensive, but if you start it at the right time, it can actually kind of go along with your permitting process and flow through very nicely.
You're leading right into my next question, which was going to be is how long does it take to complete this stuff? You know, talking about investigations, remediations, and how from start to finish. You know, I mean, does this add to the overall process to the time someone gets a certificate of completion or certificate of occupancy for the site?
Yeah, it could add to the schedule, but ideally if we get in at the beginning phases of the development before they've even purchased the property, we can usually fit it into their schedule to create a little to no delay. So once after we finish doing a phase 2 investigation and we confirm that there is contamination there that will make the site eligible for the Brownfield cleanup program, PWGC will prepare an application that we submit to the DEC that provides details on the site, its history, and what the intended use of the site is. From there, once the application is accepted, the ticker starts going on what we can collect for the tax credits. The next phase is doing a remedial investigation. It's similar to a phase 2, but it's more robust. It requires a lot more sampling, more areas that you have to collect these samples from. We prepare a report on that. We submit that to the state. They review it, the DEC and the DOH. Once they are happy with the report, they approve it, and then we can go on to the next phase, the remedial action work plan. This is where we start planning how we're going to remediate the site. This is what the contractor has to implement as he's doing his construction. A lot of the times we like to incorporate the construction and the remediation as much as possible. So property might be developing a building with a basement. Part of our remedial action work plan will be excavate the contaminated soils. So in this case, the developer is not seeing any added expense. For the most part, they're not seeing any added expenses that they weren't going to incur anyway. Now, all throughout this process, there are a lot of steps. I really compressed it, but there's a lot of documentation that has to be done. That's in the form of work plans, reports, and then there are mandatory public comment periods. 30 days for each public comment period, except the remedial action work plan. That one is a 45-day public comment period because that's a very important document, and the state wants to make sure that the appropriate parties have enough time to review everything and get their input in. So the real fun part starts when the remedial action is implemented and the construction of the building starts. Once we finish whatever our plan details, which might be the removal of contaminated soil, some other treatment methods, and then typically installation of a site cover, which many times is the foundation of the building, the concrete slab. Once that site is fully capped, usually PWGC's time at the site ends, and we're just finishing up our final reports so that the site can obtain its certificate of occupancy.
Okay. So from start to end, for, say, P.W. Grosser, if that makes it a little bit easier, how long are we involved?
I would say the initial part from the application to the preparation of the remedial action work plan could take up to a year. We have some flexibility on how long that takes. And then the actual implementation of the remedial action is really dependent on somebody else's schedule, usually the contractor.
Construction-based, yep.
Yep.
Okay.
And then once our final elements are in the ground or whatever our plan calls for, we can usually be finished very quickly thereafter.
Another term that I often hear associated with BCP or Brownfields is an end zone. What is an end zone? Can you guys explain that to our listeners?
Sure. So let me first explain why an end zone is important.
Sure.
Throughout New York State, any site originally could enter the BCP program without facing certain criteria. In 2015 or so, the program was reworked to make it there was too much incentive already in New York City for property development, so they realized they didn't always need the Brownfield cleanup program to further that incentive. So what they did was they changed the program so that any city with a population of 1 million people or more, which in New York is only New York City, would have to face one of 3 criteria or gateways to get into the program. One gateway is the end zones. Another gateway is if the property is underutilized or underwater. It means the remediation cost will cost more than the property is worth. And the third gateway is if they're using affordable housing for the property. So an end zone is it's set by the Department of Labor in New York State. It's a census tract, and it looks at poverty levels and unemployment levels in that census tract. And if that meets certain criteria, it's deemed an end zone. So it's an economically disadvantaged area. Throughout New York City, there are end zones in all 5 boroughs. The Bronx does have the majority of the end zones, but you can find them even in Manhattan and Upper Manhattan.
Interesting.
Oh, and I'm sorry. That will actually allow you to qualify for the tangible property credits in New York City. You can still enter the BCP in New York City without the tangible property credits. It's not as lucrative in terms of the amount of money you can get back.
I got it. So, one of these end zones, what type of information do I need in order to apply for this?
It's actually very simple.
Good.
The New York State has a GIS map that you can load into Google Earth, and it populates where all of the end zones are in New York State. If your property is at least 50% within an end zone, you can qualify for the tangible property credits.
I mean, that's to me, it's making it sound more and more enticing. There's more and more opportunity for people to get involved with this program where they could, do something good for the environment, develop a site, and not lose their shirt in the process. With these credits, tax incentives. I mean, it's making it sound more and more worthwhile in my mind. It's just, how do you get people to be aware of this? I mean, how do developers or site owners, what's publicizing this?
We publicize it to our clients. A lot of the developers in New York City are very well aware of the program.
So they're savvy about it already, but I mean,
they've at least heard about it.
I mean, is the state doing anything to, make this program, make people aware of this program?
I don't know how to answer that one. They have it on their website, Paul.
Yeah,
I don't know how much outreach they're actually doing.
I think it's really coming from the consultants, the attorneys, the people that are in the know.
The construction industry.
Yeah.
So it's like you said, it's the people that already know about it that are just spreading the word and making sure it's being utilized.
Yes.
Got it.
That does bring up a good question or follow-on point. When, in addition to an environmental consultant, a developer should have a good environmental attorney on their team. It's really adds value, especially when they're going through the acquisition phase of the project. The language in the purchase-sale agreement, which can, if you're not careful, can leave the purchaser with the burden unnecessarily. And in dealing with the DEC on the more legal related issues, the wording in the order on consents, and the legal issues at the back end where you might have an environmental easement on the property. An attorney can add some value on making sure that the client is
Andy,
is
I think
covered.
that's a great. What you just brought up is great. It got me thinking right away. Besides the environmental consultant like PWGC or an attorney, are there any other key players that have to be part of this BCP, program for an owner to develop the site? Care to elaborate on that? Is there anyone else like environmental contractors, surveyors, people collecting borings, labs? Who else gets involved with this?
There's a lot of parties that are involved in the Brownfield cleanup program. You actually just named quite a few of them.
Didn't mean to steal your thunder, but I got my mind racing here.
Actually, I'd like to bring up one specific group that a lot of people don't think of. It's the surrounding community. Part of the plan is you have to have a community participation plan. That plan is written in plain English for the neighboring community. They don't have to be the science nerds that we are to understand what is going on at the site. And I think this is one of the greatest parts about the program is that you want that community involvement. You want them to participate in this. Every time that we do a 30-day public comment period, a notice is sent out to the community so they can be aware of what's going on. We do air monitoring to protect the surrounding community to make sure that the work that is going on the site isn't migrating off the site. And I'm sure the community likes to know that there's a new, probably great development that's coming in that's going to be replacing a property that may have been an eyesore, may have been, underutilized, and now they have maybe a new store coming in. They have a new building coming in that they could live in. It could be new jobs, construction jobs for the construction of that property.
Could be affordable housing.
Affordable housing, yep. Permanent jobs for whatever's the new building, if it's a commercial or manufacturing property. There's a lot of great incentives there for the community itself to want that property to be redeveloped.
I mean, you keep spurring more and more questions here, but not to take up our time all day and to keep it brief for our listeners, but it sounds like there's a lot of benefits here. A lot of people can benefit from this, and we did talk about the tax credits. Are there any other benefits just besides the financial incentive that come out of this?
Yeah, I would say I've already touched on some of them. Removing the eyesore from the area.
Yeah, a blight, sure.
Cleaning up a property so that the future occupants are in a property that they know is safe. Either the site is cleaned up to a unrestricted use, which means it's cleaned up, basically completely, or there are engineering controls put on place to keep that property safe for the future occupants. Sometimes we can't get out all the contamination. It's the nature of the beast. So we put in controls that help continue to remediate or protect while the site's in use.
So again, spurring more questions. You mentioned we can't get all the contamination all the time. What dictates or mandates where we can stop?
That depends on what our intended use of the property is. We do still want to meet that the cleanup objectives of that intended use. Sometimes we can't, and so we have to, there's 3 different tracks of remediation. Track 1 is the unrestricted use. That's the cleanest you can get. Track 2 is has specific site cleanup objectives: restricted residential, commercial, industrial. And then there's the track 4, which is a site-specific cleanup objective. So the DEC and the DOH work together to come up with the cleanup objectives that site should meet, and that is going to be based upon the intended use of the property and what engineering controls or institutional controls are put in place. As Andy mentioned, one of those institutional controls is the environmental easement. That's a document that's going to follow that property if it ever gets sold, so that the new owners of the property know what has to continue to be enacted at the site to keep it safe.
Interesting.
All those conditions are usually documented in the remedial action plan.
Oh, I'm familiar with those. I've seen quite a few in our office.
Have you signed or stamped
a couple of them?
Yeah,
get a PE stamp and you'll always have work. So you brought up another thing that, and I get involved with this quite a bit, being an engineer, the engineering controls. Can you guys just mention quickly just a couple of typical engineering controls that we may put in place at a site that will be there for probably quite a while, and sometimes, we do reach a point where they're no longer necessary, but can you just describe a few of those?
I'd say the most common engineering control is the subslab depressurization system. What that does is basically it creates a preferential pathway for contaminated soil vapor beneath the property to reach these pipes that are installed beneath the concrete slab, and then it's routed up to above the roof line. So basically it can no longer... a concrete slab it's a porous entity that soil vapor can migrate through. So we try to prevent that with the subslab depressurization system. By creating that preferential pathway, that soil vapor can go into that pipe and then be exhausted up above the roof line so that it will not accumulate inside the building.
So do we have to treat that exhaust sometimes, or is it okay to just discharge to the atmosphere? What happens then?
It depends on the concentration of the contaminants beneath the slab. At certain levels, we do have to do treatment. A lot of times that is a carbon drum, or a lot of times that is a 55-gallon drum of granulated activated carbon. It's similar to what you might see in your water filter on your tap. So once the contaminated air passes through that filter, it's considered treated and it can be discharged to the atmosphere.
Interesting. And what type of regulation or oversight or monitoring has to be done once you put an engineering control in place?
Usually there's annual requirements to do a periodic review report. Before we get to that, the final report that we prepare for a site after the remediation has been completed is called the final engineering report. If the site does not meet a Track 1 cleanup, usually there is a site management plan that accompanies that final engineering report. That site management plan will lay out what you have to do for future activities at the site. That could include annual monitoring of the site. Sometimes if you have monitoring wells there in the groundwater, you might have to do quarterly groundwater sampling until you exhibit levels that are low enough to either reduce the frequency of groundwater sampling or eliminate groundwater sampling. And all of that is documented in a periodic review report, which is usually submitted on an annual basis. It involves also an inspection of the property, make sure the use hasn't changed, make sure that the site cover is still in place, and other things. Again, the main purpose is to make sure that the occupants of the property are safe.
Oh, wow.
And the site cover is also a very common engineering control.
Yeah, definitely Jennifer brought that up, and we are familiar.
Your building footprint, concrete, sidewalks, asphalt.
Asphalt parking, sure.
And then typically any landscaped areas or open areas have at least 1 or 2 feet of clean, unrestricted use, a level fill, so that there's no direct contact to contaminants that we may have left behind in accordance with any approved plans, but it's not available for people to come in contact with.
So are there any limits to how long you have to go into the future with monitoring or sampling, or is it just dictated based on how the numbers go?
It goes on for a while. I just got off the phone with someone this morning complaining to me because he has to do another PRR. And
PRR is what?
A periodic review report.
Thank you.
Why do I have to do this every year, Andy? Why can't we stop doing it?
I'm actually working with a client right now. We have a plan with the DEC and DOH to try to eliminate further further monitoring. It's going to take a couple more years to get to that, but we at least have that plan in place to get us there.
Wow. I mean, this is interesting, this whole Brownfields cleanup program. You guys, we've basically taken from what is a brownfield all the way through the whole process to now we've got the site cleaned up, it's occupied, and we're into simple monitoring and, I guess, maintenance or periodic review, if you will, right? And that's essentially the end of it, right? At least as far as PWGC's involvement. I mean, the owners and operators have to continue to monitor and maintain and comply with the regulations, but it sure is an interesting process. Guys, have any closing thoughts or comments you want to make on a Brownfield cleanup program?
In the last few years, BCPs have been a big part of our workload.
Sure have.
It's part of our core business at this point.
Absolutely. Probably, I'd say almost half our technical staff are one way or another involved with that type of work. So it is impressive. I'm glad to see that it's going, it's progressing in New York City. Do you guys see any movement out here on Long Island with it? I mean, obviously I can see the real strong benefits in New York City, but what about for Long Island?
People don't consider the off-site liability. That's a huge benefit if you don't have to undertake a groundwater plume remediation exiting your site. So we are seeing more and more of it on Long Island. And then I also would just like to throw in that there are some other similar type programs to the BCP program, specifically in New York City, that maybe we'll talk about in a future podcast. The New York City Office of Environmental Remediation e-designation program, which is very similar to a BCP program, has some liability protection benefits.
Yes.
There are some grants, I think,
Yeah,
for
some limited grants. I think the max you can get is about $50,000.
Yeah. So there's no tangible tax credits associated with it, but it does get you through an approved program so that you can get a certificate of completion and construct. It's a little bit different than the BCP program. I don't want to get into it here, but maybe something we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. It keeps spurring more and more thoughts for me. But I do want to thank you guys today for your time. Jennifer Lewis, one of our senior project managers, and Andy Lockwood, who is a senior vice president of our environmental unit. And I am Paul Boyce, again, the host, CEO and president of PWGC. Again, to our listeners, if you found anything here stimulating or you want to find out more about it, please reach out to us on our website, which again is pwgrosser.com/podcast. And we will have more on this topic with upcoming podcasts. And again, I thank everyone for their time.